And my name is Howard Eber, and I am an alcoholic. I'd like to welcome everybody to week number 3 of this cycle. We started out our first meeting in the cycle by talking about some of the pre-Oxford group history. And last week we started to get into the forwards and the preface. We are now in the forward to the second edition, which is the most interesting of all of the forwards. It is so ripe with history. It takes some time to get through, but it's worth slowly studying because we're going to be asked to do and to follow the example set by these people if we want to recover from a hopeless state of mind and body that is alcoholism. And the natural question comes up, well, who are these people? How did this thing come about? Well, that's what we're talking about now, is how this thing happened. It was a happening. It wasn't one person's idea and that was how it developed. This is really a happening that everybody here who has a sponsor can trace that line back to two people. So everybody here now, we are all part of that happening. And that means that everything we say has value. Anything we share at a meeting is going to get repeated long after we're gone. So let's be careful about what we share because it does mean something. It does set an example. We are in forward to the second edition. I believe we're on page XVI. And we had just talked about how Bill Wilson, how the spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck in Akron in June of 1935 when this New York stockbroker, Bill Wilson, and it's very generous to call him a stockbroker, but we'll go along with that, and an Akron physician, Dr. Robert Smith, met and formed what became Alcoholics Anonymous. But before that happened, Bill Wilson had a spiritual experience, a life-changing spiritual experience in Towns Hospital, where he was, I think, on his 4th stay to be treated for alcoholism, in which he was relieved of the obsession to use and was blessed with the desire to help others to achieve the same thing he did. And prior to his having that spiritual experience, we talked about 2 things that had to happen in Bill Wilson's life. One, he had to know what the problem was. And the first time he was hospitalized at Towns, Dr. Silkworth, and we're going to learn a lot about Silky when we read the doctor's opinion, Dr. Silkworth told him, he diagnosed him. He says, you're not evil, you're not bad, you're not morally corrupt. You have an actual illness, a malady made up of a physical type of allergy and a mental obsession sparked by a spiritual malady that makes you forget everything that happens every time you drink and you give in to that obsession and trigger the allergic reaction, which in your case is craving. The first one wants the second one calls for the third. By the time you get to the 10th drink, you want that 11th drink more than you wanted anything ever in your life. So it's made up of this. It's not a bad person. You're not an evil person. And the other thing that had to happen is Bill Wilson had to find out about a solution. Knowing the problem wasn't enough. Step 1 isn't enough. We have a lot of other steps. One step isn't enough. He had to know what the solution was. And he found that when his boyhood friend, Ebby Thatcher, who was the worst alcoholic Bill ever met, paid him a visit, and he was sober. And he explained how he got sober by his involvement in the Oxford groups, this first century Christian fellowship that believed in achieving absolute purity absolute honesty, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love by going through certain spiritual activities like restitution and amends and sharing, which later became our steps. And he told Bill that he got involved with them and had a spiritual awakening, and he was relieved of this obsession to use. So those two things had to happen before Bill could have his spiritual experience. And he had his spiritual experience. And where we are on page XVI, the top chapter, we had gone through the Oxford Group's program of action, the tenets of the Oxford Group. One of the comments that was made here in the preface is is that Bill couldn't accept all of the things about the Oxford Group, and some of the things that he didn't care for that were problematic to him were, for one, they had a leader. They had a leader, a guy by the name of Frank Bookman. They believed in promotion. They wanted to get celebrities and famous people to convert to say they've converted to their way of doing things and changed their life. And they publicized that. They believed in publicity. They were a temperance movement. They wanted alcohol wiped off the face of the earth. They didn't go along with relapses. If you drank and relapsed, you were out. And it was not just a focus on alcoholics. They wanted to change the world through one person at a time, changing himself, his community, and so on. And Bill Wilson wanted to concentrate on alcoholics alone, which is why he separated from the Oxford groups. They declared him, I believe the term was unpure, because he wanted to focus only on alcoholics. So there's some. Okay, sorry about that, guys. The Oxford group tenets we were talking about were on the bottom paragraph, the bottom of the paragraph at the top of XVI, where it says, though he could not accept all of the tenets of the Oxford group, he was convinced of the need for, now see if this sounds familiar. Number one, moral inventory. And yes, I've numbered them in my book. Two, confession of personal defects. Three, restitution to those harmed. Four, helpfulness to others. And five, the necessity of belief in and dependence upon God. Sounds like a pretty familiar program of action. Well, that's where our steps came from. Now, if you're curious about what happened to the Oxford group, the Oxford group was not mentioned anywhere in the first edition. We're reading the forward to the second edition, which came out in 1955. When the first edition came out in 1939, it was a different world. Part of the world was about to engage in a great war. And the head of the Oxford group, Andy, if you'll give me, I think it's number 37, the Bookman article and quote. Frank Bookman went on a trip to Europe, visited the heads of state at several countries, including Germany. He met with Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Goering. And he came back from his trip and he was quoted in the New York papers and the New York World Telegram as saying, I thank heaven for a man like Adolf Hitler who built a front line of defense against the Antichrist of communism. If you go to the next one, Andy, you'll see the actual article that we're talking about. No, Andy, I think that's 38. I'm sorry. And obviously making a comment that's complimentary or favorable to Adolf Hitler in 1939 in New York was not going to go over too well. And you see the caption that was used on the picture. Thank heaven for a man like Hitler. Well, that pretty much put an end to the Oxford groups.
Mhm.
Still exist today under different names, but that was the end of Frank Bookman's involvement at that point. So those were some of the things that we needed to know about the Oxford groups. You could take that down, Andy. And we're going to get back to the book. Finally get back to the book. Middle of the page, prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that, and please highlight and underline the rest of this sentence, only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic, but he succeeded only in keeping sober himself. When he got sober and had the spiritual experience, he went out to the Bowery in New York, to the Salvation Army. He was calling on drunks all over the place and telling them, hey, buddy, let me tell you about the spiritual experience I've had. And they didn't want to hear any of it. And he was getting kind of dispirited about it. And the story goes that he spoke to Lois, and Lois said, well, one person's staying sober, you. Why don't you go talk to Dr. Silkworth and see if he could give you some advice for how to approach these people? And he went to Dr. Silkworth, and Silky told him, you're doing it all wrong, Bill. You're working it backwards. You're telling them about a solution before they've become interested. What you need to do is to get their attention through identification. I couldn't do that with you. I could only tell you about the allergy and the obsession and so on, but you can bear testimony to that. Tell them your story. They will identify with that. They will then ask, if they're interested, how did you do it? And then you can tell them about your spiritual experience. But you can't start with that. You have to get their attention. And the hair on the back of my neck stands up when I realized that the very first person he tried that approach on was this Akron physician. So let's continue in the book. The broker had gone to Akron on a business venture which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. And please highlight the rest of the paragraph, the next 4 lines. He suddenly realized that in order to save himself, he must, and I'll stop there for a second. One of the things we do in the workshop is we highlight all of the musts for people who say there are no musts in the big book. Well, there's a lot of them. We have a list we compile of it, and if anyone's interested, just send me an email and I'll be glad to send it to you. I think right now I've got about 139 of them listed, and this is one of them. There are a lot of musts. Sometimes they appear as MUST, sometimes they appear as essential. There are a lot of different ways of saying must, but there are 139 examples of it in the big book. So don't ever say there are no musts in AA. There's a lot of them. He must carry his message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician, Dr. Robert Smith. The physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed. Bill, this business venture had collapsed, and I don't want to spend too much time on this one. And his partners from New York abandoned him and went back to New York, and Bill was left alone in Akron to try and figure out what just happened, why their business deal fell apart. And he found himself in the hotel lobby of the Mayflower Hotel. And on one side was the bar, and he can hear the laughter, and he can hear the clinking of the ice in the glasses. And on the other side was a phone booth with a church directory. And he would realize, because he thought he was going to go strike up a conversation in the bar. And he first said, well, I'll just have some ginger ale. And then he rapidly went to, well, maybe 3 drinks and that's it. And he realized he was on thin ice, and he realized he needed to talk to another alcoholic. So he went to the phone booth. He found someone by the name of, well, we're going to get into that a little later. He found somebody who eventually directed him to Dr. Bob. We'll get into the sequence of events later, but he got to Dr. Bob. And Dr. Bob unknown to Bill, had been involved in the Oxford groups. That's what we're referring to here when we say he had tried spiritual means, but it failed. He was involved with the Oxford group. He tried their activities. And every time he did, he celebrated with a drink and triggered the allergy. So it never worked for him because he didn't know what the problem was. He was treating it with a solution, but he didn't know what the problem was. He didn't know what was wrong with him. Here's a medical doctor, a surgeon, incidentally. He was a proctologist, and I don't know what your procto is, but I don't know if I want him cutting into mine if he's drinking a lot. But be that as it may, he was a doctor. He was an educated guy. He knew how to quote chapter and verse from the Bible. He didn't know what was wrong with him. So every time he tried these activities and he celebrated with a drink, he triggered the allergy and was back to square one again. So that's what we're talking about when he says he tried spiritual means, but had failed. Back to the book. But when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he'd never been able to muster. Let me go back through that sentence because there's an awful lot there. When the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description, I've got that highlighted. He gave him a description of alcoholism. And above that, please write allergy/obsession. And everywhere we come across the term real alcoholic in the book, we're going to try and remember to underline it and write A/O on top of it. So we're always clear on who we're talking about, that it's not somebody else, that it's us. If I have the allergy and I have the obsession, I'm a real alcoholic. So Dr. Silkworth, as we said before, gave Bill the definition of what was wrong with him and its hopelessness. The physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy, the solution that he had tried to use before when he didn't know what was wrong with him, but now he was pursuing it with a willingness that he never had before. So I've underlined spiritual remedy, and I've underlined willingness. He sobered, never to drink again. Please highlight that phrase. And you may want to circle never to drink again, because it's the first reference of many in this book to another expression that people say we shouldn't use. And that expression is permanent sobriety, permanent recovery. It is possible to achieve permanent recovery. Yes, it's a one day at a time program, but you can achieve permanent sobriety by maintaining the spiritual practices of the 10th, 11th, and 12th step, by remaining spiritually fit, by always having the right motive no matter where we go. We can remain permanently.
Howard, you're muted.
Did that just start? Yeah, okay, sorry. That Dr. Bob sobered up never to drink again to the moment of his death in 1959. The story goes that Bill got to sit down with Dr. Bob on the first meeting that Dr. Bob did not want to partake in, but his wife kind of convinced him to do it, and he agreed to sit for 15 minutes. So Bill and Bob met at Henrietta Seiberling's home. They sat down for dinner. Dr. Bob was shaking so badly that Bill said, "You know, buddy, you look like you could use a drink. Come on, let's go talk." And he brought him into another room. And instead of spending 15 minutes, they were in that room for 6 hours. And Dr. Bob came out, and the first thing he said to his wife was, "This guy is the first person I ever met who knew what he was talking about alcoholism. And he's going to come back with us, and he's going to stay with us for a while, and he's going to help me, and we're going to help other people." And that's what we're talking about here. But Dr. Bob did have a slip, because Bill told him about the spiritual solution he found. And Dr. Bob said, "That's all great, but I don't know if I can go along with this restitution thing, this amends thing. I've got a practice that's almost disappeared because of my drinking. I'll lose it all if I go around making amends to people. So I don't think I could do that." And sure enough, that reservation cost him, because he went to a medical convention that he always goes to, and he always gets drunk. And Bill said that to Lois, to Annie Smith, that you can't protect him, you can't ban him from going, you can't hide him from alcohol. It's all over the place. If he's going to drink, he's going to drink. And so Dr. Bob went, and he did indeed drink. But when he came back, he told Bill, "I'm ready to work it all the way now." And he did make the amends, and he sobered up, never to drink again. And the date that we use, it says he sobered, never to drink again. You may want to write down the date that's agreed to as the date of his sobriety is June 10th, 1935. We recognize that as the AA birthday. Now, there's some controversy about that. It could be a few days later, but I'd rather not get too deep into it at this point. That's the day we use. We've always used that date. That is AA's birthday. So, bottom of the page, please highlight this sentence. This seemed to prove that, and let's highlight the rest of it in pink, because this is a promise. It's another thing we do. We highlight promises and prayers in pink. We'll put that in the chat. It was in the emails that I sent out the first week. But if anyone wants to get the highlight key, someone will put it in the chat for you. So we highlight musts in green and prayers and promises in pink. And here's a promise. The first promise, well, actually the second promise in the book. The first promise was in the title. How many thousands have recovered? It's the first promise in the book, and it's in the title. So now here's another promise, that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. In other words, the therapeutic value of one alcoholic helping another is without parallel. Without parallel. It indicated, and please highlight the rest of this sentence, it indicated that strenuous work, it also indicated in telling, strenuous work, and please underline strenuous. We're not talking about just going to meetings. We're talking about strenuous work, one-on-one, eye to eye, nose to nose, face to face with other alcoholics. And if you're not sure of that, the next part of his sentence tells us that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, please underline that. And above it, I've written one-on-one, was vital. And please underline vital. Vital is defined as life-supporting, life-giving. My lungs are not necessarily vital organs, because I could live without one of them. If I, God forbid, have to leave, I had a one that had to be removed. Same thing with my kidneys. My heart is a vital organ because I've only got one and I can't live without it. I'd managed to live most of my life as if my brain weren't a vital organ because I didn't use it that much, but technically your brain is a vital organ. And he's saying that working with alcoholics one-on-one was vital, life-supporting, life-giving. Two, and here it is again, please underline, permanent recovery. Second reference. Hence, the two men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving in the ward of the Akron City Hospital. Their very first case, and you may want to write the gentleman's name above that. His name is Bill Dotson, Dotson. Andy, if you'll give me, I think it's 6 or 11. Bill
No, we don't
Dotson,
have that file.
no?
What's
Dotson
the file? What's the
and
name?
Bile. Dotson Pick and Bile. Dotson Pick. Well, I'm going to continue while Andy's.
Yeah.
You got it?
Yeah.
Here we go. This is a gentleman we're talking about. It says in the book that their very first case, a desperate one, recovered immediately and became AA number 3. Bill Dotson, his story is in the big book. It remains in it. It's right after Dr. Bob's nightmare. It's called AA number 3, creatively. He was a well-known attorney. He was hospitalized 8 times in the past 6 months prior to meeting Bill and Bob. He was in such violent shape when he was in the hospital that they had to strap him down. And Dr. Bob and Bill called on him, told them their story, and he got sober as well. That's Bill Dotson. And many people know Bill Dotson as the man in the bed, in that famous painting, Man in the Bed, which we'll get into at some other point. Not really Bill Dotson, but that's what the legend has, so I'll go along with it. But that's where Bill Dotson, that's AA number 3. That's who we're talking about, is this gentleman right here. And he was admitted June 26th. He was visited 2 days later after he had detoxed a bit by Bill and Bob. Okay, back to the book. So he became AA number 3. And please underline this, he never had another drink. That's reference number 3 to permanent recovery. 3 references in less than 1 page. This work at Akron continued through the summer of 1935. There were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. When the broker returned to New York 3 months later, and you're going to have to add that, it doesn't say that, but he stayed in Akron for 3 months with Dr. Bob. So when he returned to New York after 3 months in the fall of 1935, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at the time. What I'm going to suggest you do is start to keep account of the number of people that we're talking about. So in the left-hand margin, right here where it says of 1935, I've written the number 4. There were 4 members of Alcoholics Anonymous. We had Bill, we had Dr. Bob, we had Bill Dotson, and we had a gentleman by the name of Ernie Galbraith. Those were the 4 members. When Bill went back to New York, he left 3 of them in New York, in Akron. And Andy, if you give me, if you will, no, I didn't. I thought we had the drunk squad. Don't we have
Yeah, we've got it. I'll get it.
number 36 or something like that? Sorry, should be better organized. My fault. When the book says that the first AA group had been formed, that they didn't realize it was because they were still following the tenets of the Oxford group. And the activities were giving to God, surrender, listening to God's direction, checking for guidance, restitution, sharing for witness, and confession. These were the things that they were practicing. These were the things that when Bill left to go to New York, he took with him. He brought it there, he brought it back. And in Akron, this is what they were following. So the first group had been formed, even though it was part of the Oxford group, it was referred to as the drunk squad of the Oxford groups. So we could take that down, Andy. Back to the book, a second group promptly took shape at New York, to be followed in 1937 with the start of a third at Cleveland. You may want to note in the margin that group in Cleveland was formed by a gentleman by the name of Clarence Snyder, S-N-Y-D-E-R. There's a great book about Clarence Snyder called How It Worked. The author of that book, Mitchell Kay, is here today. I'm honored that he's part of our group. You should pick that up because Clarence Snyder is very much, to me, one of our founders. He wound up on the wrong side of several arguments with Bill, and so he's not remembered as a founder. But certain things that he instituted have become part of our culture, like sponsorship, like rotation of officers, like communication between groups. All of these things were things that Clarence Snyder started. Now, Clarence Snyder came from Cleveland to Akron, got sober under Dr. Bob's guidance, went back to Cleveland and formed a group in Cleveland. And that's what we're referencing here, that third group. Besides these, there were scattered alcoholics. Incidentally, I'm back in the book. There were scattered alcoholics who had picked up the basic ideas in Akron or New York who were trying to form groups in other cities. By late 1937, in October of 1937 is what we're talking about here, the number of members having substantial sobriety time behind them was sufficient to convince the membership, and please highlight this, that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic. And in the margin to the left, let's put the number 40, 40, because what we're talking about here has become known as the Counting Noses meeting, the famous Counting Noses meeting. In October of 1937, Bill returned to Akron and he sat down with Bob and they basically took stock. How many guys you got here? How many guys you got in New York? How many guys you got in Akron, in Cleveland? And they counted 40. And they realized we may very well have a solution for the problem of alcoholism here. And before it gets watered down and diluted and perverted, we need to put it down on paper. So we have a specific program and we let people know how we came up with that. So I think we should write this book. And the money we're making from this book, and here's where Bill Wilson, the visionary, comes into play. He said we're going to be making money by the carload, and he meant railroad cars, not Chevrolet cars. And the money that we make from that, we're going to use to fund a chain of hospitals, nationwide hospitals specializing in alcoholism and drug addiction, because you couldn't get treated for that at a hospital in those days. You had to be admitted with a different diagnosis. But this was going to be specially dedicated to, it was the beginning of rehabs. The vision of Bill Wilson became rehabs. And obviously, Dr. Bob would head that up. And then we're going to have a chain of missionaries, basically, to go out and bring people into the hospitals. Probably Bill would handle that. And all of the money for that was going to come from the sale of this book. And that's what was decided when Bill went back in October of 1937, and they had this Counting Noses meeting. And they counted the noses, and Bill came up with this idea, and they voted to approve that idea. So back to the book. It was now time, the struggling groups thought, to place and please highlight and underline message and unique experience. The message and unique experience. One alcoholic helping another is without parallel. To place that unique experience before the world. This determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women. The fledgling society, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous. Please underline and highlight the following from the title of its own book. Now let's stop there for a minute. Bill decided we're going to write this book and we're going to make all of this money. And he put the book together. And originally they were unsure of the title. So they had come up with the name of A Way Out by Alcoholics Anonymous. And Bill asked one of their members, a gentleman by the name of Fitz Mayo, who lived closer to Washington, D.C. than Bill did, to go to the Library of Congress and see how many books are out that are using a title like A Way Out. Now, the number that he came back with varies. I've heard people say it's number 12, which is the significance of number 12. I've heard 27. The point being, there were a lot of books using that title. So Fitz Mayo suggested, why don't we just call it Alcoholics Anonymous? And Bill liked it, sold the idea to the rest of the group, and that's how the book got its name. And when the book came out, the very first group to call itself Alcoholics Anonymous was Clarence Snyder's group in Cleveland. Another innovation of Clarence's. I'm telling you, pick up Mitchell's book. You'll be fascinated by all of the things that Clarence gave us. Let's take a look at, we're talking about the book, so let's take a look, Andy, at number 39. They had commissioned the artwork for the book, a gentleman by the name of Ray Campbell, whose story was in the first edition. It's called An Artist's Conception, I think. An Artist's, I'll think of it in a minute. But he came up with the first cover on the right, the Pathway to a Cure cover, which was quickly abandoned because of the use of the word cure. And on the left is the cover that they did adopt, which came to be known as the circus cover because of the bright colors. An Artist's Concept. That's the name of Ray Campbell's story that was in the first edition, was removed, and now you'll find it with all of the other stories that were removed in a book called Experience, Strength, and Hope, published by World Services, incidentally. All of the stories that were ever removed from the book are put in that. And his story was in the book, and they adopted his cover, the circus cover, rather than the Pathway cover on the right. And Andy, if you give us, just for the hell of it, number 40, the next picture. What I've done is I've shown you all 4 editions of the big book. The first edition had the circus cover on the left. The second edition, which came out in 55, had a black cover. The third edition, Alcoholics Anonymous, had a blue cover. And the fourth edition, which is the one most of us are holding right now, has the blue and the yellow cover. These are the 4 first editions of the big book. There were some modifications made along the way, but this is the first edition of each of these books. All right, we could take that down, and so that explains a little bit about what we just read in the book. I hope it does. And oh, incidentally, we're talking about the title of the book. They came up with a way out, but there were other titles that they were bouncing around. They thought of Dry Frontiers. They thought of Haven. They thought of Comes the Dawn. Somebody who remained nameless thought of the idea of calling the book the Bill Wilson Movement. Wonder who that was. Well, that didn't last too long anyway. And there was another idea that they were going to go with. They were going to call it 100 Men. But then someone by the name of Florence Rankin got sober and became the first woman. So they would have had to call the book 100 Men and a Woman. And it might have sold a lot of copies, but probably for the wrong reason. So they abandoned that and went with A Way Out. And those are some of the titles that were thought of. Okay, let's get back to the book. The determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939. As I said, it was, I don't think I said it, but it's April 10, 1939. April 10th, 1939 was the date of the first edition. I think I mentioned that when we were talking about the forward to the first edition, but be that as it may, that's the date. There were 4,730 copies made in the first printing, 4730. The book sold for $3.50, who was supposed to sell at $3.50. So it says the determination bore fruit in the publication of this volume. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women. So in the left-hand margin, now let's put the number 100. So we went from 4 to 40 to 100. The fledgling society, again, which was the drunk squad, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous. And as I said before, from the title of its own book, and I'm reading it for a second time because it's important that we recognize that the fellowship was named after the book, that the book is the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. The program is not the fellowship. In the beginning, those two things were together. Somehow over the years, we got separated into the fellowship of the fellowship and the fellowship of the Spirit. The program is in the book, the 12 steps. The program is not in the fellowship. The fellowship will help support and direct us to the answer. The steps provide the answer and the solution. So they decided to call the Society Alcoholics Anonymous from the book, and he says the flying blind period ended and AA entered a new phase of its pioneering time. With the appearance of the new book, a great deal began to happen. Dr. Henry Emerson Fosdick, I love some of the names in this book. Ebby Thatcher's full name incidentally was Edwin Throckmorton Thatcher. They got some great handles. It's unbelievable. Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, the noted clergyman, reviewed it with approval. In the fall of 1939, Fulton Ausler, then editor of Liberty magazine, printed a piece in his magazine called Alcoholics Anonymous. Andy, if you'll give me number 41. The date of publication of this article that we're referring to in Liberty magazine was September 30th, 1930. This is what the cover looked like. This is what the article looked like. This put us on the map. Not quite as big as the next article, but it started to let people notice, to know about us, rather. All right, we could take that down. This brought in a rush of 800 frantic inquiries into the little New York office, which meanwhile had been established. And you may want to underline this next sentence. Each inquiry was painstakingly answered with literature, with books, by mail. our message was now being spread, not word of mouth, which is the way we started. Our message is now being sent out by mail. And the fact that Bill and a part-time secretary answered these 800 inquiries is astounding. But they're saying that they did, so I'll go along with it. And it says pamphlets and books were sent out. Businessmen traveling out of existing groups were referred to these prospective newcomers. If people were traveling out of New York and they were going to some city, wherever they were going, they would find the inquiries from people in that city and give the information, the contact information, to the person traveling to that city. And he would look them up when he got there and try and organize a little fellowship there as well. That's what we're talking about. Businessmen traveling out of existing groups were referred to prospective newcomers. New groups started up, and it was found, to the astonishment of everyone, that AA's message, and please highlight this, could be transmitted by the mail as well as by word of mouth. Please, above word of mouth, put the number 1. That's the first way our message got circulated. Above the mail, where it says the mail, put the number 2. That's the second way our message was circulated. There are going to be others, so let's keep track of them. And please highlight this last sentence. By the end of 1939, it was estimated that 800 alcoholics were on their way to recovery. And in the left-hand margin, I've written the number 800. So we've gone from 4 to 40 to 100, and now we're at 800 by the end of 1939. In the spring of 1940, John D. Rockefeller Jr. gave a dinner for many of his rich friends, to which he invited AA members to tell their stories. News of this got out on the world wires. Inquiries poured in again, and many people went to the bookstores to get the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, one of the things I sent out to everybody in the email was a note about, was an article really about the Rockefeller dinner. I think that's just Rockefeller notes and articles, Andy. This is an actual transcript that I sent out of this dinner. They went to Rockefeller and told him their plan. They wanted him to invest in their book so they can get the hospital started and the missionaries started. And when they went to Rockefeller, he personally said, I think money will ruin this thing. This is what it looks like. Rockefeller himself could not attend the dinner, so he had his son, Nelson Rockefeller, who later became governor of New York, did the speaking, represented the Rockefeller family. So in your emails, you'll find this article, this whole transcript, rather. Let's go on to the Rockefeller dinner, Andy, if you would. Rockefeller dinner. John D. Rockefeller held this dinner. There's a picture of Nelson Rockefeller on the left. On the right is where they had the dinner at the Union Club in New York. It says the dinner produced favorable publicity, and in that transcript I sent you are a couple of articles that were printed that indicate the favorable notices that they were getting. It raised $2,200 for the attendees. Rockefeller gave a little more, less than half. Rockefeller and the dinner guests continued to provide about $3,000 a year up to 1945 when they were asked to stop. The Alcoholic Foundation received the donations and income from sales of the Big Book from that point on. So he said, I'm not going to give you that money because I think it'll ruin this society. So I'm going to give you a stipend. And he gave them enough so that Dr. Bob didn't lose his house and Bill could continue to do his work without having to go out and look for a job. Andy, you could take that down. But that's the Rockefeller dinner, the significant dinner. He invited his rich friends, and Bill brought a whole bunch of people with him. In the transcript I sent you, there's an accounting of everybody that was there and everybody that spoke, and you'll recognize a lot of those names. But they all came and they made a pitch to this group of wealthy people who eventually decided to go along with Rockefeller and really not give him very much money at all, because they felt it would ruin the altruistic nature of our fellowship. And thank God for that. That's one of the what Bill called the chains in the cosmic coincidence that led to the formation of Alcoholics Anonymous and a survival of Alcoholics Anonymous, is that we weren't funded. Okay, so let's continue. In the middle of this paragraph, it says, by March 1941, please highlight this sentence, the membership had shot up to 2,000. So in the margin to the left, I've written the number 2,000. Then Jack Alexander wrote a feature article in the Saturday Evening Post that placed such a compelling picture of AA before the general public. And Andy, you can get ready with that cover. I think it's 42. That Alcoholics in Need of Help really deluged us. And please highlight, by the close of 1941, AA numbered 8,000 members. So in the left-hand margin, under where I have 2,000, I've written March 1941, 2,000 members, end of 1941, 8,000 members, and that's very largely because of this article that you're looking at. There's the cover. On the right side is the article. I know many people don't usually pay attention to it, but when you go to meetings, and you could take that down, you'll often see a rack of IPs. You can get a copy of the Jack Alexander article at almost any meeting that you go to. You can get it from World Services. We've printed it up in this little IP. IP, I think number 12 is what it's called, the Jack Alexander article. See, Jack Alexander was what was called a muckraking reporter. He was going to go in and bust up this scheme of Alcoholics Anonymous, that it couldn't be legit. And he was won over. He was so convinced that he became one of our strongest advocates forever. So he didn't find any muck to rake. When he came after us, he wound up supporting us, wrote this favorable article, and we went from 2,000 to 8,000 within 1 year. Let's continue with the book. This mushrooming process was in full swing. AA had become a national institution. Just out of curiosity, I want to show you something. Andy, if you'll give me the statistics, the membership number 19. I'll show you an interesting thing here about how we grew. This is from World Services. I didn't make this stuff up. This came from World Services. And if you'll notice the numbers, we went from 1935 to 1945. The first 10 years, we went from 2 members to 12, almost 13,000 members. From 1945 to 1955, we went from the approximate 13,000 members to 135,000 members, 10 times. We multiplied tenfold. The next 10 years went from 200,000 to 533,000. We doubled in the next 10 years. From 1975 to 1985, the next 10 years, we went from 500,000 to almost 1,500,000, meaning we tripled. By 1991, you'll see it highlighted there, we hit 2,100 members. As of 2023, World Services says we now have the same 2,100 numbers. Now, I think there's a lot of reasons that account for that, one of which I think is unquestionably the fact that there's now a fellowship of AA within the program of AA, and some people just go to meetings, but there's something else. World Services tells me that there are over 600 organizations, fellowships, that have requested use of our 12 steps. Right now, they say there are about 200 that are currently, that they know of, that are using them. So as far as I'm concerned, our 12 steps are continuing to save lives and have members, but they're not reflected in AA statistics because they're getting helped through Gamblers Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous, and so on. There's an anonymous fellowship for almost any condition, Anxiety Anonymous, Nicotine Anonymous, all based on the 12 steps. So we could take that down, Andy. Please underline this first sentence. Our society then entered a fearsome and exciting adolescent period. Highlight, if you will, adolescent period. Because the book refers to this particular period as the adolescent period, and I maintain that we are still in our adolescent period. And I say that because of the reasons that are listed here and then some of the others for why they called it an adolescent era, and see if you don't think the same way. So let's continue. The test that it faced was this. Could these large numbers of erstwhile erratic alcoholics, remember, we were a little bit more than eccentric. We were crazy people. Could these crazy people hold this thing together? So he said, these erstwhile erratic alcoholics successfully meet and work together. And here's number one question, and put number one and underline the following. Would there be quarrels over membership, leadership, and money? Do you think we've outgrown that? Or do we still have issues with leadership, membership, and money? I think we do. Here's number two. Would there be strivings for power and prestige? I think we still have to deal with that. So we're still in that adolescent period that he's mentioning was this particular time. And I'm going to add a number three. I gave you 1 and 2 in the book. In the blank area on the top of the next page, I'm going to suggest you write number 3. These are some of the other things that they faced and we're still facing. Would there be cliques, CLICKS, gossip, conniving, drama, theft? How many groups have had their treasury stolen? It happens. Would there be 13 stepping? All of these problems existed then, and I maintain they exist today. So we are very much still in that adolescent period. But let's get back to the book. I want to try and finish this section before we open it up. Would there be strivings for power and prestige was number 2, and I gave you number 3. Would there be schisms, meaning divisions, cracks, which would split AA apart? Soon AA was beset by these very problems on every side in every group. But out of this frightening, at first disrupting experience, the conviction grew, and please highlight this, that AAs had to hang together or die separately. And next to it, please write tradition number 1. That became the foundation of our first tradition, our common welfare and our primary purpose. We had to, and let's circle we had to in green, because that's a must. We had to unify our fellowship or pass off the scene. And I'm going to go through the next paragraph, and let's see if we can identify the traditions that they're talking about. As we discovered the principles by which the individual alcoholic could live, those principles, above principles, write 12 steps, and underline the individual alcoholic, because that's what we follow, or our 12 steps. So we had to evolve principles by which the AA groups and AA as a whole could survive and function effectively. The traditions. And I've highlighted the rest of the paragraph. I'm going to suggest you take a second and do that, because I'm also going to suggest some notes throughout this paragraph. It was thought that, and please underline, no alcoholic man or woman could be excluded. That became the third tradition, because in the Oxford groups, there were exclusions. That no man or woman could be excluded from our society. Tradition number 3. That, and please underline this, our leaders might serve but never govern. Tradition 2. That each group was to be, underline please, each group was to be autonomous. Tradition number 4. And there was to be, please underline, no professional class of therapy. Tradition 8. Please underline the next sentence in its entirety. There were to be no fees or dues. Our expenses were to be met by our own, and underline this 2 or 3 times, voluntary contributions, not donations, not admission charges. I've mentioned I'm going to be starting a traditions workshop, hopefully sooner than later, and we're going to base that on reading and studying Comes of Age. And in Comes of Age, they go through all of these stories of what was going on in those early days, and there were groups that were charging admission, not passing around the basket for contributions, but were charging $1 for people to come in. So we're saying that there are no fees or dues. Our expenses are met by our contributions, which is tradition 7. There was to be the, please underline, least possible organization, even in our service centers, which is became tradition 9. Our public, please circle that word, public relations were to be based on, and let's underline, attraction rather than promotion, and that became tradition 11. It was decided that all members ought to be, please underline this, autonomous at the level of, and underline this twice, press, radio, and film. Tradition 11. Not within the fellowship. So if you want to use your last name in a meeting, go right ahead. I've been doing it for years. I've taken a lot of abuse over it because people accuse me of violating traditions, and it's not. Dr. Bob wrote in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. I don't want to take it out now, but it's on page 264, Bert, if you want to look this up. Dr. Bob suggested that if you withheld your name from a fellow member of Alcoholics Anonymous, you were violating that tradition, the same as the guy who went out in the street and identified himself to the cameras as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. One was violating the traditions above that level, the guy who went outside and talked to the press as Alcoholics Anonymous, and one is under that line. Under that line is within the fellowship. How else are you going to know? You speak to a guy, he says, my name is Bob or Bill or Howard or Scott or Kathy or Andy. How about a last name? There may be many of them. So let's try and try and finish this before we wrap up. And in no circumstances, please underline this, should we give endorsements, make alliances, or enter public controversies? Traditions 10 and 6. This was the substance of AA's 12 traditions, which are stated in full on page 561 of this book. Please underline and highlight this phrase, though none of these principles had the force of rules or laws. They became widely accepted by 1950, that they were confirmed by our first international conference held at Cleveland. That's July 1950. Today, the remarkable unity of AA is one of the greatest assets that our society has. And I'm going to stop at that point. Hopefully we'll finish this stuff next week. I know we went a little longer than planned, but I wanted to at least get through these traditions. We'll open it up for hands. You got a few minutes. I think, Angela, you had your hand up. No? You got to unmute. I can't hear you. All right, Angela, we'll come back.
Howard, this is Susan. Oh, we have one question in the chat. Are the 4 covers that you showed on our book, are those USA covers?
Yes. Well, we'll go on to Suzanne. We're running out.
Howard, I can't raise my hand, but whoever, go ahead. Just let me know whenever you're ready for what you're ready for.
Oh, okay. Is it you? I see some hands. All right, let's go through the hands up, and then you guys just raise your hands if you like. Suzanne, let me unmute you. There you go.
Thank you. Yeah, Suzanne, alcoholic, and I'm going to try and make this really quick because something happened this week, and I kind of know what my position on it is, but I want to make sure I'm correct in this. There was an experience at a meeting this week. It's a closed step meeting. Guest speaker came in. A really, a gentle young man came in, clearly brand new, never been to a meeting. It was a closed AA meeting. And he very, very diminutive, I can't say that word. He said, I have an addiction to marijuana. I hope it's okay. I'm here. He was so apologetic. And you could tell he was just crushed. He just came in off the street. And everybody was being kind to him. And I was actually chairing the meeting, and I was going to let him finish sharing and then suggest he sit and listen and get with one of the guys after the group. The guest speaker reamed him for being in the meeting and not being an alcoholic. Now, my question is, am I wrong in thinking that this is a person who's just looking for help, and we can say, this is how our meeting is, and still be kind to him? Like, I just feel badly about it, and I want to make sure that my thinking is correct about it. Thank you.
My feeling about it is that's something for the elders of the group, some of the elder statesmen of the group, to talk to the young man. That's how I would handle that. I'm sorry about the not being able to unmute. I've since corrected that. Amanda's our timekeeper. We're gonna have to go with maybe 2 minutes here. Let's go with Samsung SMX200, whoever that is. Could you unmute, please?
Don't know, is that me?
Yep.
Yeah, oh, thank you. I would, do you know, have you got the fourth name? I missed it. There was Bill, Dr. Bob, Bill Dobson, and what was the other guy's name? The fourth one?
Ernie Galbraith, Galbraith. Ernie Galbraith married Dr. Bob's daughter, Sue Smith. Dr. Bob never cared for Ernie. He called him, quote, a uniquely unlikable fellow. I think in today's language, that would be he's an asshole. He didn't like him. Ernie Galbraith eventually relapsed and they divorced, but that's number four.
Oh,
Okay.
that's the fourth one. Lovely, thank you.
Okay, George Katie.
Yeah, I'd like to get the information for tonight's meeting at 10 p.m. Eastern time. That wasn't in the chat. And then I'd also like to say thank you for the heads up on last night's meeting. That was a great presentation you made, and you took the criticism very well.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, George. And I'll send the check to the address you gave me. So thank you. Kim, I'm going to put up that flyer while is talking. Hope it's not distracting.
I'm
Okay.
an alcoholic. Thank you, Howard and Kathy and everybody that is of service. And I had just a question on XVIII. You had said that in March 2041, there was 2041 sober people, but then you gave another date too for
Yeah, what I said was in March of 1941, we counted 2,000, not 2041 to be
okay.
pedantic here, but 2,000 is what I said. And then by the end of 1941, the same year, we had gone up to 8,000.
Okay.
That's the publication of the Saturday Evening Post article that largely accounted for that. We quadrupled.
So of the same year.
Yes, within the same year.
Thank you.
Okay, I hope everyone got that. Patrick, you're next.
Thank you, Howard. Just a reminder to something that was posed here about someone coming in that had another addiction, whether it be substance or gambling, a habit or food, whatever it is. I want to try to be of service. So love works every time. I don't need to flip out on someone. They're a hurting human being. I need to direct them in the right direction where they can find fellowship with their own particular issue. But I don't need to shit on anyone. So that I just wanted to mention that, Howard.
Right. I agree with you. And I'll take it a step further. I was many years ago at an AA meeting, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, you know, you really don't belong here because you're more a drug addict than you are an alcoholic. You need to go to Narcotics Anonymous. And that's the way he left it. And he said he represents AA. And I was too new to know any different, but I didn't let that bother me. I was thick-skinned enough. But the point I want to make is, if you were to say something that stupid, at least give them some data. If you want to send somebody to Narcotics Anonymous or Overeaters Anonymous or Sex Addicts Anonymous, give them a contact, put them in touch with them, show them how to do that. If you're going to send them somewhere, tell them who to talk to, etc. Just a suggestion. Deborah, I think you are next. We're running a little over, but let's try and get these few hands up. Deborah?
Hey, hi, I'm Deborah, and I'm an alcoholic. Hey, Howard, I see the traditions, and it also was a question in the chat, but which is tradition one?
Oh, it was at the end of the paragraph that preceded it. AAs had to hang together or die separately.
Wait a second.
In the paragraph that precedes this, it ends with AAs had to hang together or die separately. We had to unify our fellowship or pass off the scene. Became tradition number one. Or common welfare
Okay.
comes first.
Okay, so that AAs had to hang together or die separately. We had to unify our fellowship or pass off the scene. Thank
Right.
you.
Common
Thank you.
welfare comes first. Candy.
Hi, Howard. I'm Candy Alcoholic. Thank you. Such a great meeting this evening. I just one of the flyers that you had up, I just want to make sure I have the right ID for Peter Marinelli. It went by so fast. I have it written down. My friend has it written down. I just want to make sure it's the right number.
Andy, would you put that up while we
Thank
get
you. I
last
appreciate that.
question? Bert, and then we could wrap it up. Thank you guys for keeping it brief. Bert?
Yes. Hello, fam. My name is Bert. I'm grateful for becoming alcoholic. No, I'm not a guru either. But what I've learned in AA is if I'm going to help somebody, but I also have to first ask how to help them. You know what I'm saying? I don't make no decisions by myself. You know what I'm saying? I need help too. So if I was going to talk to that person, I probably would have had somebody with me or whatever, or talk to somebody. How do we do this? Because I remember the story, and you quite know it, about the gentleman that came in and they had to get some help to find out if that person was supposed to be there or not, or something to that effect. And they called Bill W.
Mhm.
You remember that? So, I mean, it's all about, I don't know everything or anything else. So I would definitely ask somebody, how do we handle this? You know,
The story that Bert is making reference to, he showed up at the clubhouse who was a Black alcoholic drug addict,
right,
transvestite, homosexual. That was his claim.
right.
They didn't know whether they should let him in. And they called Bill, and Bill said, did he say he was an alcoholic?
Yeah.
Said, yes. Then let him in.
Yeah.
That's the story that Bert is making.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah. So thank you for letting me share.
Okay, Carl, and we'll wrap it. Carl.
Howard, can I jump in there, please?
Yeah. Go ahead, hon.
Hello.
Yeah.
Everybody keeps sneaking them in here and putting their hands up. Yeah, my name's Carl.
Carl, wait. Go ahead, Kath.
Yeah, no, I knew the line was gone. The only thing I just want to point out was I'm not being pedantic or actually, but on page XIX, when we started going through the principles for the individuals and the principles for the A groups, we just went over it, and I don't recall hearing you saying it, but maybe you did. But A as a whole, so A as a whole is a 12 concepts,
Mhm.
and we didn't mention that. That's all.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Good point. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Beautiful. All right, Carl. You got on mute. There you go.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Howard and Kathy. This is more of a personal question because my sponsor was someone just like you too. Just love this stuff. Just love this stuff. Spent all day. He was retired. He had enough money. All that, so that's all he did. Now, is that the same? Is that the same thing for you too? I mean, do you and Kathy, do y'all find any time to go out for dinner, or because y'all always doing something? Hey.
Certainly seems that way, Carl. It certainly seems that way.
Okay, I just wanted to.
Okay, Mitchell, and incidentally, here's Mitchell's book available on Amazon, How It Worked, the story of Clarence Snyder in the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous in Cleveland, Ohio. Go ahead, Mitchell.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. Just quick thing, the guy at the clubhouse, that was Barry L, Dr. Barry L. The guy who wrote Living Sober, he was the one who worked with, met with that guy at the clubhouse who came in, and Barry talked about his hair was long and blonde, a la Veronica Lake, which was my favorite line. I had to go look up who Veronica Lake was. But on the thing about the meeting and the guy with the marijuana, you talked about the other night, the four absolutes, and which is something that came out of early AA in Ohio. Honesty, unselfishness, love, and purity. For me, what happened with that guy in the meeting was like totally against what everything AA stands for. Honesty is like, is it right or is it wrong? Selfishness is how is it going to affect the other person? There's a whole, it's, my motive's pure. Am I doing this out of love? And everything that person said, reaming him out, had nothing to do with AA or the four absolutes. It wasn't what we're all about. I mean, if it was me, I would have taken that person and took him outside the meeting and said, like, hey, it's an outside issue. I understand that. I'm sorry for what the guy said to you, but let me get your number. I'll give you my number. I'll find out the information of where to go and who to contact, and leave it at that. But that's why I keep the four absolutes in my life on a daily basis. This is how I measure my motives, measure who I am and what I do. How is it going to affect the other person? If I'm reading somebody out at an AA meeting, I don't know if they're going to go out and get drunk. I don't know if they're going to go out and kill themselves. I came in with the gift of desperation. I don't know what that guy had. So I don't ever threaten somebody's life. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mitchell. Thank you all. Thank you for indulging us a few extra minutes. We're going to wrap up with Charlotte. It's going to lead us out with page 164 and then the Lord's Prayer. Charlotte.
Very much for allowing me to be of service. Thank you, Howard. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, everyone. And it is a pleasure to meet you, Mitchell K. A vision for you. Our book is meant to be a suggestive only. We realize we know only a little. God will constantly disclose more to us and to you. Ask him in your morning meditation what you can do each day for the man who is still sick. The answers will come if your own house is in order. But obviously, you cannot transmit something you haven't got. See to it that your relationship with him is right, and great events will come to pass to you and countless others. This is the great fact for us.
Please enjoy.
Abandon yourself to God. You understand.
Give yourself to function and to your Really, what you find is joy. Shall be with you in fellowship and spiritual. You will surely meet some of us. Tread your road. May God bless you and keep you. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Kingdom come, will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. We forgive those
kingdom, power,
deliver us from evil. And the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen.